Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lynn Gilbert. I actually work in the Northern Piedmont District Office and currently also serving on the Conference Board of Pension and Health Benefits. We are so glad you're joining us for one of the Winter Leadership Training workshops tonight on financial faithfulness in uncertain times. So welcome. Just a few housekeeping things as we get started. Before we get started, a little bit of Zoom etiquette for tonight. We do have everyone muted as you came into the meeting, and we ask that you keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. If you would like to speak, for instance, to ask a question, though, we're going to ask you to put those in the chat. Also, you would need to unmute by clicking the microphone in the bottom left of your corner if you're using a computer. There will be a brief video from Bishop Leland, so you might want to have your sound on early on. Please do use the chat. Click the chat at the bottom of your screen to ask questions or make comments. We'll be watching that throughout the meeting. We are a large group, so you might want to we're up to now 106. I think we had about 180 to register. So you might want to set your view to speaker view instead of gallery view. So you'll be seeing our speakers in addition to the slides that we'll be showing. And I will say we are recording this session. All of the winter leadership training events are being recorded and will be available after this week sometime on the conference website. So if you know folks who'd like to watch or share at your local church, you'll be able to do that. So thank you for your patience. We're certainly glad you are here joining us. And now Reverend David Snipes is going to have our opening prayer.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and welcome everyone from near and far. If you would please bow your heads, and I'm going to ask that as we go to God in prayer this evening, that we just take a few moments of deep breaths and silence and allow God's Spirit to flow in, not only into our minds, but most importantly, into our hearts. So let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for these few moments of silence in the midst of a time in our lives when things seem to be so loud and out of control. We come to you this evening with great uncertainty, not only due to a pandemic that has yet to be under control, but also from political unrest and uncertainty in our own country. And when we add this to the day in and day out things that challenge us and cause us distress, we realize how badly we need you. So God, thank you. Thank you for being present in our lives, even in the midst of chaos. Thank you, God, for giving us this place, this evening, this church where we can come and be together and share a common goal. And that goal is to be the best disciples that we can possibly be so that your kingdom might thrive and grow. I give you thanks for each person on this Zoom call and for the commitment that not only they have made to the local church and to the greater world around them, but I ask God that you empower them through your Holy Spirit, that in those places where they might be a little uncomfortable and need to be stretched, that you gently do so. but yet give them the peace and comfort in knowing that in that stretching, in that encouraging, in that nudging, that you are there with them. So as we continue our time together, we pray, oh God, that you will open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to your transformation. But most of all, God, when we leave our time together later this evening, may the words and the actions that we carry out into a world that so badly needs to hear the good news, we pray that those words, those good words, will be ours. We offer this prayer in your Son's most gracious and holy name. Amen.
And thank you. Thank you, David. We'll begin our financial faithfulness in uncertain times. We're so glad that you have joined us for this workshop, and thank you for your part in financial ministry in your local church. Just a little overview of sort of where we're going. The goal of our workshop tonight is to share important information that empower and resource the Ministry of Financial Administration in local churches. There'll be a little bit of day-to-day management information about engaging generosity as a spiritual practice and supporting a generous culture in your local church. And we will have opportunity for Q&A. And we do ask you, if you will, as you think of questions, post those in the chat. We do want to be responsive to the group here tonight, now 127 of us, to questions that you might have. And we want to be responsive to those. Next, I want my fellow workshop leaders to introduce themselves. George, you want to say hello? George, you're muted.
Broke the etiquette rules right off. Good evening, everybody. My name is George Coates. I'm currently serving as co-pastor of Hickory Grove United Methodist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm also chairperson of CF&A, the Conference Finance and Administration Committee. I appreciate this opportunity to be with you all, and you all taking the time on a Monday evening to do this. It shows your commitment to doing what God has called you to do and doing it to the best of your ability. So thank you for being here.
All right, and AJ?
Hi, I'm AJ Thomas. I'm the Director of Client Relations at the United Methodist Foundation of Western North Carolina. And I love to talk about stewardship and generosity and how that connects to our faith. So really looking forward to covering those things with you tonight.
And David.
Hey everyone, my name is David Snipes, and I am President and CEO of the United Methodist Foundation, which is a resource for each of you and your local churches. I am an ordained minister and have getting ready on February 1st to start my 20th year here at the United Methodist Foundation. So over the years, I've taught a lot of these workshops, but I am so pleased to be with you tonight because I've never taught one this way, Lynn, never taught one via Zoom. So this is a new experience, and we hope everyone will be patient with us.
All right, a brand new thing. And I also just want to say thank you to my teammate, Londa Wallace, who's helping us to monitor the chat and questions tonight. So thank you, Londa. All right, so we're going to begin with David and AJ. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to go first. AJ and I represent the United Methodist Foundation, as you heard in our introductions. And one of the things that I thought about as you guys signed up for this particular workshop was, why the foundation people? Why the Reverends AJ Thomas and David Snipes to do this? Well, I want to share with you that not only do AJ and I individually have a passion for this topic of stewardship, but if you know anything about the United Methodist Foundation, you probably know that everything that we do, we view it to be under the umbrella or the heading of stewardship. As a matter of fact, if you go to our website and you look at our mission and vision statement, we actually include a line in there where we envision a church where people live out their discipleship through the faithful stewardship of their God-given resources. Now, that's a pretty broad statement, but you know, when you think about the word steward, and if you were to look up the word steward in a dictionary, or if you Googled it, one of the first things you probably see a steward is an old term for a male flight attendant. We're not here to talk about that tonight. But what we are here to talk about is a steward as one who has responsibility for another's possessions or belongings and to use them faithfully for the purpose that person or of who they belong to go out and use them. So in this case, what we're talking about is the stewardship of God-given resources, and those God-given resources specifically related to financial resources. So Lynn, if you'll flip the slide, if we were together and doing this workshop in person, at this point, I would probably ask you to turn to your neighbor and share with one another what term comes to mind, what story, what person, what term comes to mind when you hear the word stewardship. So I'm going to invite you, in using technology in the best ways that we possibly can, to use the chat room and just put, if it's one word, if it's a phrase, whatever it is, just use the chat room and put that in there as you feel so moved. But tonight, we're going to talk about financial stewardship. And one of the best ways to do that is to talk about what stewardship is not. So stewardship is not a fundraising activity. It is not about putting a barometer out in front of the church or in the narthex of the church and setting a goal, and as people give money, coloring it in, because that indicates that it's all about reaching a financial goal. It's also not about dues paid in exchange for religious services. Heaven forbid it would be, well, that preacher really preached a good sermon, so I think I'll give a little bit more or slip a little bit more in the play. It is about a relationship with God and realizing that all that we are and all that we have is a gift from God. It's recognizing that. And therefore, when we recognize that, we recognize our role as steward, as I defined a few minutes ago. We are the steward. That stewardship of God-given resources is not just about money. Many of you have a beautiful voice. You are using that voice to sing in your choir. Many of you have this gift of teaching. So you're teaching in Sunday school or small groups or Bible studies. You are being a good steward of that God-given gift. So as people of faith, we are called to realize that all that we are, all that we have, is of God and to be used for God. Therefore, we have to be caring about that as God has entrusted us with that. And I always like to phrase it as God has blessed us, and therefore we are to be a blessing to others. And when we are a good steward, we invest in God's work and we change lives in the process. So it's really powerful and important stuff. And I think too often we think about stewardship as just being about money coming in and money going out, raising money for the annual budget. And if we get behind, we got to get out there and we've got to prompt people. Stewardship, financial stewardship, is a spiritual issue. So one of the ways that we can call attention to this is through our annual giving, as you'll see on the next slide on the PowerPoint. And this actually has to do with our annual operating budget. And normally what people do is they give to the annual operating budget, and it is the backbone of the church's ministry. Now, granted, there are ministries that can be carried out that either take very little money or possibly no money at all. But when you think about the broader context of A to Z ministry in a local church, it's going to take some money. So that is at the heart of it. So we need to encourage people to make their annual gifts from their annual income, whether that be from a job or Social Security, retirement, investments, whatever it is. But I want to call attention to this word tithe that you see in the first line, regular tithe and offering giving. So I have worked with churches through the years where we talk about tithing. We all know that tithe is 10%, and I can tell you that there have been many, many times, often more times than not, where I get pushback, whether that be from the pastor that serves the church or whether it be from the folks in the church that are sitting in the pews. Many of them don't want to hear about that. They're offended by that word tithe. And often the way it gets translated by the folks seated in the pews when the pastor is talking about it, it ends up being, well, all that preacher ever talks about is money. All they ever do is ask for money. Well, what I am encouraging you, and assuming that since you are on this call, some of you are clergy, some of you are lay volunteers, but you have something to do with the financial ministry of the church. So I'm going to encourage you, if you're a pastor, claim your pastoral authority and don't be afraid to preach the tithe, or don't be afraid to stand in the pulpit and hold people accountable for when they stand in front of God and everybody and say, I will support this United Methodist Church with my prayers, presence, gift, service, and witness. Don't be afraid of that. Claim that. And then you lay folks who are financial leaders in the church, encourage your pastor and support your pastor when she or he does that. We're going to talk a little bit later about how, as leaders in the church, it's your responsibility to set the example for everyone else. And this is one way that you can do that as a financial leader in your local church setting, is to support this idea of talking about tithing and talking about giving one's financial resources to the local church. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to AJ and let him talk to you about why people give, some of the biblical reasons. So AJ?
Thanks, David. You know, looking at the offering plate in that previous slide, just a couple of coins in that offering plate, looks like they need to do a little more teaching about tithing at that church. Might be something they want to do. You know, David, you talked about the tithe, that being a dirty word in some circles, and people feeling like that's hit too hard. And, you know, my observation and my experience with that is that anytime we find a command given to us in Scripture it's always given to us as a covered promise. That it's not something that's given to us just for the sake of, these are the rules and this is what you're supposed to do. But there is always a blessing from God that is hidden, sometimes in plain sight, in following those commands. And so when we talk about our motivation for giving, really, when we talk about our motivation for giving, that's a why question, right? We can talk about the who, the what, when, where, why, and how when it comes to giving, but fundamentally, giving is a why question. And so many times when we talk about giving, we try and answer those other things as a silver bullet without really drilling down on what our motivation is for giving and why we should give. So I've offered some biblical reasons why we might want to give. These are not an exhaustive list, but these are some that speak to me personally, and perhaps some that speak to you as well. So Malachi 3:10, right off the bat, this is where we are commanded to bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in God's house. And God says, test me in this, and see if I'll not throw open the windows of heaven and pour out for you an overflowing blessing. A reminder, a very clear reminder, a command, if you will, to bring that tithe into God's storehouse. Matthew 6:21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be too. And it's just that great reminder that what we love and who we love and our wallets always tend to go together. They're traveling companions. Luke 12:48, to whom much is given is much required. And we all have different things that have been given to us that we are asked to be steward over. And what we've been given may be very different from the person sitting next to us, but all of us are called to be faithful with what we have. John 6, it's the story of Jesus multiplying loaves and fishes. I love that one. A reminder, if you will, of a little boy who brings his lunch to Jesus, all he has, if you will. And we see that when it's placed into the hands of Jesus, it is multiplied and it is stretched and it goes further than we would have thought was possible. And then 2 Corinthians 9:6-7, each person should give joyfully and cheerfully what they've made up in their heart to give, for God loves a cheerful giver. A reminder that this is not a chore. This is not an obligation, but this is participation in the mission of God. There may likely be some other scriptures that speak to you. And again, if we were in a group in person, I would ask you to turn to your neighbor at this point and maybe share a scripture, an additional scripture that maybe speaks to you around the practice of generosity and what we do with our financial resources. But as you've been doing with the definition of stewardship, maybe you could just throw those into the chat as you're able to, and we can look at those. There are also some spiritual reasons why we might want to think about giving. Many times we try and separate the spiritual from the financial. I've heard in a number of churches, where the finance committee says, Pastor, you worry about the spiritual stuff and we'll worry about the business stuff, as if there's some separation between the financial and the spiritual, when in reality, there's a very close connection between the financial and the spiritual. In fact, the wallet, I think, is many times kind of the last line of defense, if you will, as we are trying to live maybe self-centered lives rather than God-centered lives. And so there's a very, very clear spiritual connection. What we do with our money, it reveals who or what we love, reveals what we prioritize. God also asks for our wholehearted devotion without holding anything back. And the reality is that the things or the people or the causes that we love will always rearrange our household budgets. And if you don't think that's true, let me give you a couple examples. Those of you who have gotten married, my guess would be when you got married, it probably rearranged your household budget. If you had children whom you love, it probably rearranged your household budget. And those of you who have had grandchildren, I'm sure that the budget has completely flown out the window when it's come to them. But we're reminded that the things, the people, the causes we love always have a way of rearranging our budgets. And my question on that would be simply, has your love for God rearranged your household budget as well? That because you love God, has that somehow influenced and impacted the amount of your household budget that you have dedicated to giving to God. There's also some theological reasons why giving is a priority for us. The first of those is that giving is the central act of worship. You know, when we think about worship, a lot of times maybe we think about the worship gatherings that we have and the songs and the prayers and scripture reading and hearing from God's word. All of that is a part of worship. But first and foremost, giving is a central, in fact, the central act of worship. If you go back to the Old Testament, you see a worship system of sacrifices. And that was an opportunity for people to bring something of value, something probably that they had created or raised with their own hands, to bring something of value that represented their livelihood directly into the hands of God. I love doing some word studies, and if you look into the etymology of the word worship, it actually comes from the Old English worthship, meaning to ascribe value to. And so when we worship something, or when we worship somebody, in this case, when we worship God, we're saying, God, you have value in my life. You're important to me. You are a priority to me. And so we put our financial resources there in a way that reflects that. David talked earlier about how God is generous and how we're created in God's image, and God has given us absolutely everything. You think of all the abundant blessings that God has lavished upon us, and we are blessed in order to be a blessing with others. And so because God is generous and we're created in the image of a generous God, we're created with the capacity for giving as well. And then, of course, in our theological tradition, John Wesley said to earn all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. A lot of us are great with those first two, earning all we can and saving all we can. Sometimes the giving can be a little bit trickier as well. I want to point out there, though, that he says it's all you can. Just a reminder that our means are all going to be very different, and the amount that we might have that's available to give may be different because our means are different. This isn't really about the amount so much as it is about doing all we're able to with the specific resources that we've been given. Let's also talk about what to give. We give our time, talent, and treasure. Notice that's not multiple choice. It's not that we give our time, talent, or treasure. There's an and there. And so giving in one way does not let us off the hook, so to speak, for giving in other ways. Time, talent, and treasure all work together. As Methodists, our membership vows, we promise to support and uphold the church with our prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. Again, it's all of those things together. We've already talked about how the tithe, 10% of our income, is the standard of Christian generosity. And we want to lift up that standard, and we want to teach that standard in our church. And we want to encourage every household in our church to move toward tithing if they're not there yet. Maybe you find a household in your church is giving 3%, or maybe that's what they've realized, and you want to encourage them to move up to 4%, and then maybe the year after that, move up to 5%. But maybe they could do that incrementally as a way of working toward that particular spiritual discipline. I'd also say when we're talking about tithing, to offer a pastoral word for those who may be struggling financially in the life of your congregation, that there may be people whose intent is very good in what they would like to give, but life has thrown them a curveball, and they are simply not able to give in the way that they would like to. So as we talk about giving, I always hope that we do it in a way that doesn't add guilt or difficulty on top of the shoulders of people who are already maybe struggling already in our church. I do think it's important for those of us who can give, that we do give generously, so that our church can continue to be there specifically to support some of those members of our body who may not be able to give quite as generously and quite as abundantly as they might want to right now. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. Where do we give? We give to the general budget of our local church first. This is what we call storehouse giving. Remember that text from Malachi when we're told to give to the storehouse. We can think of our local church as the storehouse, God's home of ministry, if you will, so that the food of ministry, feeding our community spiritually, can take place. This is first fruits. This is bringing what we have to God first rather than last. And it's also giving with no strings attached. I find that it's very important when we engage in an act of giving to not only release the gift, but to release our desire to control the gift. Because if we still have strings attached to it, have we really given it? Or are we still trying to offer a little bit of control? So I find that the most generous giving is to give both the resource itself, but then also to give up our control over the resource. There's some wording there that you might want to use in your bulletin and publications to communicate the priority of general giving within the life of your congregation. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that and to use that as you can. And then just a word about electronic giving. I will say electronic giving is here to stay. And if your church doesn't already have an electronic giving platform, you need to investigate that and you need to go ahead and implement that. We have certainly seen during COVID how important it is to have ways for people to give when they are not physically present in worship, but still have an opportunity to participate in the life of your church. What I have seen is that electronic giving is a great way to increase giving from people who intend to give more than they actually do. And what I mean by that is maybe they have thought about it and prayed about it, and they want to give, let's say they want to give $100 a week. But reality is they give when they're there. And so maybe they're at the beach one week, or maybe grandma came into town one week, and their intent was to do that every week, but it ends up maybe 2 out of 4 that they actually give it. If you can give people an opportunity to start giving on a regular basis where it comes directly out of their checking account, it's an opportunity for them to actually give the amount that they intended to give all along. As you offer electronic giving, there are lots of different platforms to do that. It's always a good idea for the church to absorb the cost. You want to make that as easy as possible for people who are trying to give you money to do so. So just offer that as a cost of doing business for the church. There are some options where people can check if there's a processing fee that they'll make a slight additional contribution to cover that. You could explore that as well. But there's some great ways to offer that. If you don't have it set up yet and you haven't been aware of it, the conference has set up a giving portal that you can make tithe and offering gifts electronically through the conference. And then every month, the conference will actually forward those contributions to your church. There's no cost to your church for doing that. So if you haven't gotten electronic giving up and running yet, that's a great way to help that. We'd also discourage credit card gifts. We don't want to encourage God's people to live in debt. And so we would just discourage you from making credit card gifts. A bank or a debit card or a direct debit from a checking or savings account always be the best way to go for that. And then on the right, you see an example when we are back in worship in person. I like to be able to participate in the offering as an act of worship, even though I give electronically. And that's just one way. That card is an example. You can take that, you can steal it, you can make it better. But if something that you might maybe have in your narthex that people can pick up and drop into the offering plate, who give electronically, but also are able to participate in the offering as an act of worship, just like anybody else. So let's pause for just a moment. And if there are any questions that have come up from that particular part of the presentation, maybe we can stop and collect those for just a minute. Maybe we can put those in the chat or...
AJ, there have been some great comments and responses to some of the things we've prompted. So I would encourage everyone, if you are not following the chat, go in there and look at what some of your colleagues in ministry are sharing, because they could be really great ideas for you in your local church setting.
Looks good. Lots of good thoughts in there. We'll keep those questions coming. Again, the chat will be a great spot to look at that. We'll continue keep a look at that and try and make sure that we get your questions answered. David, you want to take it from here?
Sure. So the next slide, we talk about people are more likely to support a cause when they blank, 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 the 4 bullet points there. I want to share a story with you. Relatively early in my tenure here at the foundation, I had a colleague reach out to me and asked me to come up and speak with his church leadership. And it was a combination of the church council, the finance, stewardship, as well as trustees. And part of the reason that he asked me to come was to brainstorm with them about their faith and generosity, their financial stewardship. And he had preached it from the pulpit. He had offered a personal financial stewardship study, financial peace, which we're familiar with. It seemed like he was doing all of the right things, yet people were not financially supporting the ministry. So when I sat down with them in their really nice church parlor, I started talking about what the church is about, what the church's mission is. And of course, we've referenced the United Methodist Church's mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. But when it gets to our local congregations, our local churches, because of our different settings, and because of the different resources that are available to us, and because God calls us and empowers us in different ways, that can look very differently from church to church. So I said, what is your mission? What is your mission for your local congregation? And they all kind of looked around at one another, and then seemed like everybody's eyes landed on the pastor sitting around the circle that night. And they realized through the course of that simple question, what is your mission? That they realized that they had not had a strategic visioning to really hone in and to really listen to God and to share with one another what God was revealing to them about what God was calling that congregation to do at that time and place. And so what's interesting is this has happened repeatedly for those of us at the foundation through the years, where people call us out, and it's kind of interesting, AJ, people want us to come in and give them a quick fix. And all of a sudden we'll snap our fingers and give them a few antidotes, and then all of their financial problems will be solved. And that's not the case. It takes intentionality on the church leadership to look at who they are and what God has called them to do at that particular time and place. What is their mission? So people give when they believe in that mission, but you've got to state that mission. You've got to know what that mission is, and it needs to be communicated. It needs to be printed. It needs to be seen. It needs to be spoken. Now, the United Methodist Foundation is not a local church, but I've already referenced a part of our mission statement to you. And one of the things that I ask every staff member to do is to memorize our mission statement. Because if it's important enough to memorize, then maybe you'll live it out. At the beginning of every board meeting that we have at the foundation, we use a PowerPoint and we put the mission statement up on the screen. And I either invite the board members and staff that are present to recite the mission statement with me, or I'll do a little exercise where I'll say, close your eyes, and I'm going to read this mission statement to you. And then when I finish, I ask, what words that I spoke resonate with you the most? We know who we are and to whom we belong. And I encourage you as a local congregation to know that as well, because when you do, people will get behind it. Also, the next bullet point about it, people give when they regard the leadership highly. When you as a pastor, those of you that are pastors, those of you on this call that are leaders in your congregation, when you're able to help go through that process of understanding the mission and living it out, I assure you, you will be regarded, I don't know, highly is relative, but hopefully more highly than you were before, moving in that right direction anyway. Also, people give when they perceive fiscal responsibility. What do we mean by that? Basically, we're talking about accountability there for using the financial resources that are given to the church in responsible ways. In other words, we are supporting those ministries that were approved by the church governing body, and we're not being wasteful. We're having full accountability for those funds that come in and how they go out to make a difference in the world. And finally, but probably in my book, one of the most important is to people give when there is a sense of gratitude for those gifts. Now, I've got to tell you, I have, over my years in ministry and as I've just gotten older and matured in life, I used to kind of take the position of, you're supposed to thank people when they're supposed to be giving to the church anyway. You're thanking them for doing something that they should be doing anyway. I kind of had a little attitude about that. And then as I continued to work with churches and to understand, and when I saw the power that expressing gratitude does for a church and for an individual, I came to a different position. And one of the things that I would encourage you to do is to make sure that you integrate in, whether you're the pastor or whether you're the person responsible for the finance team at your church, the stewardship team, whomever you are, the first thing that needs to come out of your mouth is thank you, thank you, thank you. And then you will be amazed at how people will respond to that. So next slide just plainly states with an exclamation point and big font, money follows mission. Money follows mission. Whatever you do, make certain that you understand who you are, to whom you belong, and what God is calling you to do. But don't take all that time to do some sort of visionary and strategic planning and then write it on the poster board, and then it ends up over in the corner of a Sunday school class. Hold people accountable and remind them of what they are a part of, which is something much greater than what they can do individually, especially through the community of faith and through the power of God. So next slide talks about leaders setting the tone. Leaders set the tone, they set the direction, they set the example for the congregation's practice of generosity. So what we're plainly and simply saying here is that if you are going to be the person that is either responsible for encouraging people to be good stewards, your annual stewardship campaign, if you're going to emphasize faith and generosity, if you're going to be the one who's responsible for heading up the finance team and making sure that the money comes in and the money goes out and all that accountability stuff that we talked about, then you need to put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to encourage people to give and to give generously as a part of their discipleship journey, then you need to be doing that. You need to be standing up. When in the chat room, there was a comment about how what had been successful in one of the churches that's represented on this call tonight was for people to stand up and to share about their stewardship and how they've lived into that, how they've grown into that. Because what happens is, as a pastor, a lot of the folks seated in the pews will say, well, you're supposed to say that, or you're just trying to raise money for your salary, preacher. We've heard it all. But the reality is when lay people can stand up, in addition to the pastoral authority of communicating that message, then it's a powerful thing, because then the person seated in the pew can say, well, that person's just like me. And if they can do it, I can do it. So we are encouraging you as leaders, whether you're clergy or whether you're laity, to set that tone that it's all about discipleship, it's about stewardship. God has blessed you, therefore we're to be a blessing to others, and setting that example in all that we do and all that we say. So AJ?
Yeah, David, I want to know that the people who are making decisions about how the church is going to spend its money are being faithful stewards with their own money. I think that's important for all of us to know. I think another part of how leaders set the tone too is when do you talk to your people in your congregation about money? Is the only time they hear about money when the coffers are bare and the cupboards are empty? Or do they get to hear about giving as a celebratory thing, and as look at all that we're able to accomplish in ministry and mission because of people's generosity? So even just how and when we as leaders talk about giving, I think can really kind of set the temperature, if you will, for the congregation's culture. So we'd also encourage you to move from kind of our stewardship campaign, if you will, more toward having a culture of generosity. We have learned that people do not learn generosity by osmosis. They don't just walk in the door and because they've come into your church, they don't know that they're supposed to give or how or any of these things. So you have to teach people to give, and you have to ask people to give, as well as modeling it among people who are leaders within your church. I'd really encourage you to move away from sort of the old stewardship campaign of 4 weeks in the fall to thinking about how you can celebrate stewardship year round. And if we go to the next slide, there's some ideas for ways that we can do that. So these are things that you can do in worship on a regular basis. This is kind of assuming we're back in person, but maybe these can be incorporated in your online worship experience right now. They can also be amplified through your other church publications, through your bulletin, through your newsletter, through your website, your Facebook, whatever other media you have at your disposal that you use to get the word out to your congregation. So something that you can do weekly, you can have just a little 30-second stewardship sermon that is tied to the offering somehow. You think about how the offering is received in many of our churches, and sometimes it's with as much ceremony as, now let the ushers come forward to receive the offering. And that's fine. But what if we shared a verse about generosity, or we shared a faith example of a teaching around generosity? Just something 30 seconds, but something that we can do week in and week out around the offering to really celebrate that and highlight that, not just as a function of something we're doing in the worship service, but to build some intentionality and some language around that. Maybe twice a month, you can have a mission moment that highlights something that's funded through the general budget. Again, we said that money follows mission, and there are so many great things that are happening in the life of your church that are funded through the general budget. People love to know where their money's going. They love to know what difference their giving is making. And so what if you had someone from the children's ministry or the youth ministry or your missions group or the music ministry or some other aspect of the church's life who could talk about what it means to participate in that ministry? And then you follow that up with just a reminder to folks that these are things that are supported through the general budget. And when we give to the general budget, we're making that youth ministry or that children's ministry or all those other ministries possible, just helping draw that connection for people. An idea that was already lifted up in the chat, a giver's testimony. Have people who are generous, who have learned the spiritual practice of generosity, get up and share that in worship, maybe once a month or so. Not in a bragging, look at me sort of way, but offering testimony to what God has done and what God is doing in that person's life, specifically through the practice of generosity. Pastors on the call, and those of you who are going to talk to your pastors, preach a biblical theme of giving 3 times a year. Maybe you want to spread that out every 4 months or so, but just offer some teaching, some biblical teaching, and really some focus around the biblical aspects of giving. And then part of that, should we pledge or should we not pledge? And I would say an opportunity for us to write down our commitment is always a good thing. And writing down our commitment increases the likelihood that we're going to follow through. There's accountability in that. So many of you, maybe you're practicing New Year's resolutions or intentions. I'm practicing some of those right now around ways that I want to eat better and get a little more exercise. I've told people who are near to me and who help hold me accountable some of my personal goals with that, because in simply telling someone, it makes it more likely that I'm going to follow through on those things. If we make a commitment and never tell anyone, it's easier for us to not follow through on those commitments. And so writing our financial commitment down and having that celebrated collectively in the life of the church, that's a great way for us to follow through and to hold each other accountable in our giving. I do think on pledge cards, it's just as important to put the emphasis on a specific behavior, that maybe someone indicates that they are going to tithe or they're going to make an increase in their commitment. Maybe they're making a first-time commitment. But whatever their actual behavior is, in addition to the dollar amount or sometimes in lieu of the dollar amount, but to really put the emphasis on the behavior. Again, you've got people in your congregation whose means are very different than the person sitting next to them. And that gives everybody a chance to be on a kind of a level playing field, regardless of what their means are, and regardless of the specific resources that they've been entrusted with. And always frame that commitment as an expression of faith, not as something that people do to support the budget. This is not, we don't give to the church because the church has bills to pay. We give for all of these reasons that we've been talking about that are spiritual and biblical and theological, everything that has to do with our own faith journey as a disciple of Jesus and who are created in the image of a generous God. So always put the emphasis on the faith commitment rather than the church's need for funds. As you've got questions that keep coming in, keep throwing those into the chat. We'll try and get to those and keep those coming. So,
thank you, AJ. I'm getting a little bit nervous about time, so I'm going to hopefully fly through some of these next bullet points, but do want to emphasize what AJ just said. Put it in the chat room, reach out to either AJ or myself directly. We are more than happy to be in ministry with you and to help you. This is all about resourcing you as leaders for stewardship in your local church. So let us be a resource if you think there's a way we can do that. The next slide talks about with the heading of use the right kind of accounts for your funds. And of course you want to use the right kind of accounts for your funds. People look at that and go, what are you saying there? The real story behind that is we have many churches that, and we could teach an entire workshop on this alone, which we don't have time for, but we have folks that, of course, you have a checking account for your operations and for the general operating budget. If you're lucky, you have some excess cash from somewhere or some designated funds that you've put into holding accounts and possibly savings accounts. But the main thing that we're trying to get across there is be a good steward. And like in the case of if you do have funds that would be qualified for a type of savings account, a CD, a UMF development fund, or if they're long-range, long-term funds that could, the risk level is such that you could invest it in the market, then choose based on the assessment of what those funds are for, choose accounts or some sort of investment account that will help you be the best steward. You remember the story of the talents? You know, sometimes it's good. You don't want to take your operating money and expose it to the market and run the risk of losing it, and then you can't pay the bills. That would not be a good steward of those funds. But there are monies that will give you some flexibility. So based on the liquidity, based on risk factors, that type thing. So you might have people in your congregation that are well versed in that. If not, please feel free to contact the foundation, and we'll be glad to help you with that discussion. And not with the commitment that you have to become a client of the foundation. We are here for you whether you're a client of the foundation or not. The next slide talks about responsible use of debt. The church can help the church acquire property or construct facilities to better serve the mission. We need to know the different types of debt, shop rates and terms, in other words, to be the best steward that you can possibly be. And then that final bullet point is to consider a UMF development fund loan, let me get it out of my mouth, which we feel have attractive terms and are unique to United Methodist helping United Methodist. Now, you may be at a church right now where you go, oh my gosh, we can barely pay the bills. What are you talking about building or renovation and taking on debt to do that? AJ can tell you, as the staff person here at the foundation that handles this particular program, we had a record-breaking year in 2020 for the churches and related ministries that took out loans with us. And so I want to tell you, that gives me hope in the midst of a pandemic and in the midst of uncertainty in the United Methodist Church as a whole, in the midst of uncertainty in the world in the greater world in which we live, people are still stepping out in faith, and they are taking on projects that require them to take on debt. So there is a process that you have to follow through the Book of Discipline and with your district office. All of those things are a matter of accountability and ensure that you as a church are not biting off more than you can chew. The next slide talks about developing a visionary plan for the future. And that's not about what I was saying a minute ago about getting your mission and vision statement in place. This is more about supporting financially ministries in the future. So one of the things that the foundation here was founded on back in the late 1960s and then kind of came to fruition in the mid 1980s was establishing endowments. And by nature of an endowment, if you're not familiar with them, it is a document that supports ministry as dictated or directed by the church or the donor who establishes the endowment. And it is funded with monies that will then be invested and will generate income now and forever for that particular ministry. Many of your churches have endowments, and those endowments could be for church maintenance and capital improvements. I've served a church where they had 17 different endowments, and they ranged from caring for the building to the music ministry, to the youth ministry, to special mission and outreach projects. Whatever you feel God is calling you to, whatever you can dream dreams and see visions and pray that God directs you in the ways that God would have you go. And that can be funded through an endowment. And of course, we can help you not only with that endowment document, which would adhere to the Book of Discipline, but we can also manage those monies related to that endowment. The next slide talks about gift planning. One of the things, when my wife and I, between the two of us, we represent 5 different colleges and universities. And then when you add our 2 kids, that jumps up to 7. We are constantly getting phone calls and mailers asking us to support their campaigns, to financially support what they're doing to try to make a difference. And so the idea is that other people are putting their shingle out and advertising who they are and that they need money. So why would the church not do that as well? So there's some ways that you can do that in healthy tax ways by giving to the church, whether it be through a charitable trust, or we used to do charitable gift annuities, and there are some institutions out there that will help you establish charitable gift annuities. But it is a way that not only can it be a benefit to the donor at the time of the gift, but can also have positive tax implications as well as generate income for that person moving forward. Then the next slide, moving on, talking about that gift planning, there's some things that can help your church finances, and oftentimes can actually help increase your income through some of the ministries that we offer. The first one being emphasizing gifts of appreciated stock. The foundation can liquidate that stock for your local church. So if you have a church member that has appreciated stock, which if they were to sell it, could have tax ramifications where they would have to pay taxes on that appreciated stock. But if they gift it to the foundation and then we turn around and liquidate it, then we can send it on to your local congregation. So this is something that that you can partner with us, and it becomes a win-win for everybody, because not only does the donor, your church member, not have to pay taxes on that, but and you as a local church may not have the tools or the venue for that stock to be liquidated. We can take care of that for you. The donor gets a tax deduction for a charitable gift. They bypass the market gains tax on that, and ministry is funded. We also offer donor advised funds. Many people view that in their mind, sometimes can get their arms around a little bit better as a private family foundation. I know AJ and I put our money where our mouth is. Debbie, my wife, and I, and AJ and Ashley, they have a donor advised fund here at the foundation where we can make gifts to the donor advised fund and then direct out or advise where the distribution should go. There's one thing that I will tell you: in donor advised funds, you cannot fulfill a pledge with a donor advised fund. But if there are additional ministries or institutions, organizations that you want to support, this might be a really great way, because we believe that when church members, donors start giving, then it becomes a habit and it's a witness, and it just continues to grow. The last bullet point, or the last 2 bullet points, charitable trusts. Trust, usually there's a lot that we could say about trust, but in a nutshell, trust is its own kind of organism, for lack of a better word, that actually helps bypass some of the tax ramifications for the donor that sets up the trust. There are different types of trusts where the donor can receive income for a certain period of time, and then upon their death, whatever remains goes to your church to fund ministry. There's a charitable lead trust, which is the opposite of that. There are so many different ways that trusts can operate, but that might be something that you might want to talk to your church members about, because you never know who sitting in the pews might have the capability to do that. So with that said, I think we are at the end of mine and AJ's part of the presentation. Rather than take up time for questions, I would encourage you to reach out to us or to put your questions in the chat room, and AJ and I will try to knock those out while you're online right now.
Okay, thank you, David and AJ. Now, George Coates is going to talk a little bit about apportionments.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, AJ and David, for the time to talk some about our stewardship. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about another aspect of what really is stewardship too, apportionments. Many times apportionments are looked at as just another obligation, and I've even heard some people refer to them as like paying a franchise fee for maintaining a church. But they're much more than that. They're much more important than that. We, the United Methodist Church, are a connected church. We're connected to the Lord, and we're connected to one another through churches and individually. It's in our nature to help one another, to give mutual support to mutual causes and support many different issues along the way. So I want to take a few minutes and talk about what apportionments are, how they are calculated, and why we should pay them. Next slide, please, Lynn. A little bit of history. Apportionments have been around as long as there has been a United Methodist Church. They began in 1784 at the Christmas conference, where the itinerant Methodist clergy and lay ministers of the church, about 90 of them, got together for a conference that lasted for about 10 days. At the end of that conference, the Methodist Episcopal Church was formally formed. And apportionments began at that time with that conference. But an important fact about them is that they were voluntary contributions. And they were used to pay the salaries for the traveling circuit preachers. They were paid to maintain the publishing house so that there were materials in common they could use. But again, a key point is that they were voluntary. Each church felt a responsibility to support the work of the church and work of the whole church, and contributed to that support. So from the very beginning, Carry On Ministry was the driving force for apportionments. They are our ministry. They're all about ministry. Okay, over the years, apportionments have supported a lot of different things, establishing schools and universities for basic education, as well as for educating clergy. Children's home, taking care of those who couldn't take care of themselves. National and international missions to take the message of Jesus Christ all over the world. And we could talk all day about what the United Methodist Church has and has not done relative to social justice, but it's always been a part of the church. Going back to at least 1908, the Methodist Episcopal Church developed a social creed, which began an organized movement within the church to continue to work on social issues within our country. Temperance was an important one at that time. In 1916, a temperance board was formed. The Methodist Episcopal Church Board of Temperance, Prohibition, and Public Morals was a major organization of the church at that time. Slavery.
George, could you just lean into your microphone a little closer? We've had someone say they're just want to hear you. We want to hear every word.
All right, I'm sorry.
That's good.
Doing the best I can. Is that better?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. One important issue that the church dealt with was slavery. What was the role of the church as far as slavery was concerned? Well, the founders of the United Methodist Church did not believe in slavery, and the church struggled with it. They had to decide whether to continue to preach and practice brotherhood like Jesus and fight slavery and possibly die as a church, or to soften its voice on slavery, accept segregation and subjugation of its African members, which was the prevailing practice in that day. Unfortunately, the church chose the latter. This resulted in a split that created the Methodist Episcopal North and the Methodist Episcopal South. Gambling was another important social issue. Methodism dealt with that. Moving on, the church supported church literature and hymnals. United Methodist Publishing House dates all the way back to 1789 and has come through many tough times over the years, but has continued to be supported. Even going through the pandemic right now, the publishing house is losing because with the churches closing, there are not many people in the ordering business. So the church is struggling. The Methodist publishing house is struggling, but apportionments continue to support it. Clergy pensions, supporting bishops, evangelism and church development all over the world have been supported by the apportionments that are paid by the local churches. In North Carolina, going on to the next slide, there have been, you see the educational and other efforts that have been funded by apportionments. Duke University, Bennett College, Pfeiffer, High Point College, High Point University now, Brevard College, Greensboro College, the Children's Home, Aldersgate and Gibbons Estate and Arbor Acres for our older United Methodist members who live at these places. UMAR, camps and counseling centers, all these activities go on in this state because of the apportionments that are paid by the local churches. Next slide, please. One last piece of history. In 1968, there was a merger between the Methodist Church and the United Brethren Church. Now, we can imagine that an organization that has existed for 174 years, since 1784, had developed a lot of complexities and ongoing needs that voluntary apportionments were not able to take care of adequately. So as part of the merger with the United Brethren in 1968, apportionments became required and they were assigned. So they continue to be a part of who we are, but a more systematic way of garnering those funds, getting what is necessary to support the ongoing work of the church all over the world came into play. Next slide, please. So even though they're no longer voluntary, we are a connected church, and we pay these apportionments so that we can work together to do more than we could do, what none of us could do alone. That is why we pay apportionments. 37% of all that we do goes to general church apportionments. And these are the items that are within the funds that are supported by them. The Episcopal Fund, which supports bishops around the world. Africa University, the first fully accredited United Methodist related educational institution on the continent. 11 historically Black colleges and universities are supported through the Black College Fund. The general administration of the church all over the world. Interdenominational corporation, unity, working with other Christians to get the work of the Christ done everywhere. Ministerial Education Funds supports 13 United Methodist seminaries and provides scholarships. Many of us who are United Methodist ministers, myself included, have benefited from ministerial educational funds. World Service Fund, general agency work around the world, and the Jurisdictional Conference Fund. This supports the work of the various jurisdictions around the world. So these are important reasons to continue with our apportionments. Now, okay, 63% of what we give supports our conference budget, 63%. Our district operations, conference support, equitable compensation funds, which help churches that may not be able to support a full-time minister. Clergy medical leave and benefits funds. Again, supporting those clergy members who must leave because of health reasons. Mission and ministry funds and their district apportionments to fund the operations of the missional engagements, the benevolence, and congregational development throughout our districts. So 63% of that supports the district operations that we have. Now, how are they calculated? Each church pays its proportionate share of the annual conference budget. So we each pay our quote unquote fair share based on our relative part of what it takes to operate. There are 3 steps to calculating apportionments. 1, we find a multiplier. We take the total conference budget and divide that by the average net expenses of all the churches. Now it sounds complicated, but it's really not. We then take that multiplier and use that against the average of your individual church's net expenses, a rolling average over 3 years. So those bumps are smoothed out and you have a more consistent calculation. For example, the calculation for 2021 for Hickory Grove United Methodist Church, where I serve as co-pastor, we start with the 2021 budget and apportionments approved at the annual conference of $13,747,000. The average net expenses of $191,364,498. If you do the math, the multiplier there is 0.07. And you multiply that times the 3-year average expenditures of the church of Hickory Grove, and you get to $40,806. The third step brings in our portion of the district funds to support the operations of the district. The district budget divided by the number of churches in the district gives us our proportionate share of what is necessary to support the metro district. So if we added those together, we'd have our number for 2021. Now we can all get the information to calculate this and see where it comes from. And a lot of that information, if you turn to the next slide, comes from these year-end statistical reports that we are working on right now. Apportionments paid, appointed clergy benefits paid, appointed clergy compensation, staff compensation and benefits, program expenses, and operating expenses. We take those expenditures and add them up. Now, there are some things that are not part of the calculation. Funds that go to missions, advances, and special Sundays. Funds that we give to support the work of missionary projects, disaster relief, global health, construction. Those kinds of numbers do not play a part in calculating the apportionments. Principal and interest on debt. If a church is in paying back a loan or paying back principal on a loan, that is not part of the calculation. Capital improvements made to your facility. Those dollars are not part of the expenditure calculation. And membership is not a factor. Whether you have 1,000 members or 100 members, that would not be part of the calculation of your apportionments. That's a misunderstanding that has come up over the years because it used to be, but it is not, has not been for a number of years a factor in the calculation. One of the good things is that 38% of what we pay out in allocations, in apportionments, comes back to the church, either directly or indirectly. Through mission and ministry, it's about 30%. Missional project within the district, campus ministries, counseling, new starts that take place, equitable compensation and medical leave, that's about 6%, making salary grants to churches, archives, the resource center, moving, that's about 2%. So that adds up to 38% that comes back to the churches either directly or indirectly. I asked our district superintendent in the Metro District, David Hockett, for his thoughts on apportionments. And I'd like to read what he wrote back to me. It is true that almost 40% of every apportionment dollar is returned to local churches. 2020, perhaps more than any other year, has brought that home. Through apportionment dollars, we have been able to provide salary, pension, and insurance grants to support the ministry of our local churches in a very difficult time. Apportionments funded the online giving portal a number of our local churches are now using to encourage online giving among their members. Apportionments provided the funds for every local church in Western North Carolina to have a Zoom account. Apportionments are funding our January leadership development seminars, which we're participating in right now, for laity and clergy to help strengthen our ministry and their churches, and all at no cost to the individuals who will participate in the training. In addition, apportionments fund the salaries of our district and conference staff who support our clergy with health and pension related issues and questions. They enable us to meet regularly with clergy and laity to address the challenges and opportunities they are facing, to connect them with resources, and sometimes pay for those resources to problem solve, to work through conflict. It enables staff to lead more than 165 laity from around our district to engage in conversations and planning around issues of racial justice and healing. Apportionments support the excellent work done every day in supporting the clergy and laity through our district office. Apportionments are funding new faith communities, fresh expressions, dinner churches, etc. Apportionments provide the resources for our annual lay servant training, mentors for local pastors and clergy beginning their ministry. Apportionments provide salary grants for churches who otherwise could not afford a pastor. They support ministries with the poor and hungry in Concord and Charlotte. Umar, a recovery ministry in Monroe, pastoral counseling and mental health care for laity and clergy through our Methodist counseling centers. Vitality grants for churches seeking to strengthen their ministry and mission, and so much more. Apportionments enable us to do more together than we ever could alone. Again, the example of Africa University, missionaries all over the globe, campus ministries, continuing education, and leadership development for laity and clergy, support for college and seminary students, and more. I know that churches struggle at times to see the value in sending our money to the conference and district. My prayer is that we will always be good stewards of those funds and that we can see their apportionment dollars as an investment in what their church, the United Methodist Church, is doing to literally make the lives of their neighbors and their neighbors' churches better. They do represent what we can do when we do it together. Again, going back to something that David said earlier, stewardship is about caring for all God has entrusted to us. Our apportionments are a part of that. Investing in God's work, changing lives, our apportionments are a part of that. Being a blessing to others, apportionments are a part of that. We should pay apportionments because we are connected, and working together, we can do more good alone. We could do what none of us could do alone. Thank you. And I know that there are some questions in the chat.
Thank you, George. I'm just going to recount a couple of the questions. We have had a couple of questions on PPP loans, and that's way beyond our time available to talk about tonight, but there are some resources already about that on the conference website. Actually, WestPath is providing resources about that, and I'll be in touch, and George will, with Mark King about providing some additional information. With the most recent Congress action, there's even more information about that. So we'll defer those and look for that in conference communication or from your district. We do have a question about how to know how much your apportionment is and what your outstanding amount. That's public information on the conference website. If you go to the conference website and click on administration, there's a click for apportionment giving. You can see that for every single local church in the conference, and it's a link to from your church dashboard, which I'm going to mention here quickly in a minute. George, there's a request for the copy of David Hockett's letter that someone sent me, so we might be able to add that to our handout and make that available if you think that would be okay.
I don't think he would have a problem with that, but I'll double check before I send it. Okay,
thank you. And then there's a question about, is apportionment mandatory or optional, and what are the consequences of a local church for not paying? Apportionments are determined, and George showed you the calculation. As far as consequences, apportionments are one of the indicators of financial health of a congregation. That's just a part of the conversation. Churches work hard and are so faithful and take great pride in paying their apportionments and being a part of the worldwide ministry and conference and district ministry in the church. So we're grateful for those efforts by every single local church. And as there are indicators of financial struggle in a local church, district superintendents and the cabinet can work with local churches on what the answer to that is. Apportionments in the discipline are stated as the first benevolent responsibility of a local church. I think that covers the questions right now. You can keep putting those in the chat. I'm going to briefly, I'm seeing our time, I know we're at 8 o'clock, go over the financial resources handout that's part of the handout that you can download today. I'm not going to read it to you. It's a lot of self-explanatory information. I will just highlight a couple things. The Book of Discipline is, of course, an important resource that lays out information about all kinds of things related to governance in local churches, and certainly related to finance. So your church should have a copy of that and be able to use that for reference. A particularly important one for local churches, finance committees and treasurers and pastors to use is the guidelines for leading your congregation. There's a full set of those for all kinds of leadership roles in the church. The one on finance is available. You can get that through Cokesbury. I would urge every member of every local church finance committee to read and absorb the wealth of information that's included in there. It talks about discipline requirements and has all kinds of best practice information for local churches related to local church finance. I will say that we also have other PowerPoint available that sort of highlights some of that, but that's just such an important resource for you to use in your local church. There's also financial records, there's stewardship guidelines. Your church might even want to purchase the full set of guidelines. That's maybe the most economical. I think it's about $70 or something like that. And you get all of them and also PDFs of all of those and be able to have license to share those and print those or share the PDFs with members of church committees. That's probably the most economical way to get those. On the next page, I mentioned the local church audit guide. An important function every year for local churches is to the local church audit that's mentioned in church conference paperwork. There's a great resource on that the GCFA provides and a link to that. Then just take advantage of all of the resources that are available on our conference website. Under the administration section, there are all kinds of resources for your local church if you go to administration and click on the conference treasurer page, all kinds of resources, financial resources for your local church on that. And then all kinds of other, you can see your apportionments, you can see, you can get to directories, you can get to benefits and administration information, all kinds of forms that are available, like the remittance form that you use to send your apportionment giving and other special gifts to the conference. I'll let you see all of those. There's COVID resources. I hope you've been taking care of those. Then on the GCFA, the General Council Administration, also, again, lots of resources available to local churches, including additionally the tax packet, which has lots of tax questions answered for local churches, United Methodist churches. The legal manual is out there. The tax exempt group ruling. If your church is, changing a bank account or doing something like that, you might get asked for some documentation about that. So being able to get a copy of the tax exempt ruling and certifying that your church is part of that is available on GCFA. And then, of course, Cokesbury, I've mentioned resources that are available there. And then and I mentioned Upper Room, and then a very important place to get answers to questions is your district office. We encourage you to call any of the 8 district offices as a first contact for questions. And of course, the foundation for all kinds of wonderful resources that AJ and David have mentioned. I'll go over, I've got just sort of a picture of the administration page where you can see some of the headings on the left. There's also lots of clergy taxes are kind of a complex thing. And there are lots of resources online on the IRS website about anything related to clergy taxes. If you're a clergy person, that's available to you. There's also a little checklist that used to be part of the charge conference paperwork. It's not anymore, but it's a great little list of basic internal control things that are important to every local church. There's 13 things on the list, but a very basic thing that every local church, regardless of size, should be able to have as part of their policies and procedures related to finance in a local church. And there's also Mark King's contact information mentioned on there. Please reach out if you have questions. There's a little thing on sort of how the process might be about the collection plate. I won't go over that. I'll let you look at it. And then just one more one more thing, just a few reminders. Since we are in January and there are deadlines coming up, just briefly, year-end statistical reports, all that information has gone out, and the finance ministry folks have an important part in that reporting. As George told you, that some of your apportionment calculations comes right off of that information. Those are due by February the 1st. So every local church will be has a deadline of reporting those statistics by February the 1st. W-2s for pastors and employees are due by February the 1st to be in the hands of employees and filed with the Social Security Administration, and 1099 miscellaneous. In the district, as I work in the district office, every year it seems like we come upon another instance of, well, we don't give a W-2, we give a 1099. Wrong. Every pastor should receive a W-2. There's a tax case law about that. Every single pastor should receive a W-2. And there are examples of how to do that. If you have questions, reach out to your district office. We can answer those. Just a mention of accountable expense reimbursement and clergy travel expense. Everything should be by voucher. So make sure that your church is following those policies. There's information about that on the conference website, but it should be by voucher with documentation of travel and mileage and date, not betraying confidentiality, but those things. There's information on the IRS website about what a charitable giving acknowledgement should look like, and there's a link about that. If you're looking at record retention for your church, information about great resource on Archives and History website about that's in Methodist speak, not sort of business world speak, but Methodist speak about what would be good retention schedules for all of these different things we have in United Methodist in our world of administration. Just to note, the business mileage rate for 2021 is 56 cents, down 1.5 cents from last year. So that's in effect now. Some churches sort of haven't discovered the information about sales tax refunds that you would be eligible for as a local church. If you're not already involved in that, there's a link here that you can use to learn more about that and claiming North Carolina sales tax refunds that for things that your church pay sales tax on. Important thing to investigate. And then one thing I always include in when I talk about this is that there's also a North Carolina escheat law, and which basically churches are not exempt from, that is something you should pay attention to. And churches, maybe most commonly, that relates to old outstanding checks. It is not correct to write those off back into the bank account. There's actually a North Carolina escheat law that applies to that. So, and you might check to see if your church, we recently got an email in the district office. If you go to the North Carolina escheat site and search on Methodist, you find that there are lots of Methodist churches in North Carolina that the escheat fund is holding property for of varying amounts, from very small to larger amounts. So you might even check for your own local church at the escheat fund website to see if there's unclaimed property that belongs to your local church. You might get surprised. I'm not seeing, are there any more questions? Please do, and I'll let the others chime in here, other leaders, please do reach out to us if you have questions. We're trying to put a whole lot into a short period of time tonight. So are there other comments of David, George, AJ that you want to make as we wrap up?
Lynn, I would just encourage anybody who has a question related to the foundation and our presentation just to reach out to us directly, and we welcome the opportunity.
That goes for me as well. If something that I said was not clear, or if you have questions related, just contact me, and I will respond to a couple of the questions that were in the chat. I did take that information down, and we'll be getting back to you.
And the same for me. I work in the district office, but I have served on CFNA and the Board of Pension. I'm always glad to answer questions for local churches, as you know, regardless of district even. So please do reach out to us. And just a reminder, the handout, we did send an email today. I've got a couple of comments. We did send an email today that had a link to the handout, and the handout is also available on the website where you got to the leadership, got into the Zoom tonight. So I just would say thank you for being part of our webinar tonight, and encourage you. There are more webinars happening, workshops happening the rest of this week through Thursday night, 2 each night for the next 3 nights. You may have registered for some of those already. I believe there is capacity in some of those, so you can use that same link that you used tonight to get to the page that shows the button. Each night, those buttons will appear before those workshops about 30 minutes ahead. And even if you haven't registered, you could decide now to go join one of those on one of those next nights. So we thank you for joining us, and I believe unless we have something else from one of our leaders, we'll call it a night, and wish you well. Thank you for your ministry and finance in your local church and in the district and in the conference.